He stood on stage, waving the Quran, mocking its verses while hundreds cheered. It was supposed to be another viral takedown, another expose of Islam. But then, a 17-year-old Muslim girl in a white hijab stood up. She wasn't a scholar. She wasn't even invited to speak. Yet within minutes, she silenced the entire church, including the pastor who mocked her faith. With calm logic and quiet strength, she turned the stage into a moment of truth the world couldn't ignore. What did she say that made a seasoned preacher whisper, "I've never seen anything like this"? If you're ready to witness the moment ego cracked and hearts awaken, press 1 to begin. The church was packed. Rows of wooden pews groaned under the weight of anticipation. Young adults leaned forward, elderly members nodded proudly. Some held Bibles in their laps, others smartphones ready to record. On stage, beneath a massive cross and glowing stained glass windows, stood Reverend Mason Cole. He wasn't just any pastor, he was a star. Known for his fiery sermons and viral clips debunking other religions, Mason had built a reputation around unapologetic boldness, and today he was ready to tackle what he called the greatest lie of modern faith, Islam. He paced the stage with theatrical flair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "they say the Quran is a book of peace. But I've read it myself, and let me show you what it really says." He held up a copy of the Quran like a courtroom exhibit. The crowd leaned in. He began reading verses stripped from context, dramatized for effect. His voice rose, twisting sacred words into weapons. Some in the crowd gasped, others cheered. The energy was thick with mockery. "Tell me," he said with a smirk, "what kind of God commands this?" More claps, more nods. But not everyone was applauding. In the back row, seated quietly, was a 17-year-old girl in a white hijab, Fatima Noor. She sat beside her father, who remained calm but visibly unsettled. She clutched a small pocket, Quran fingers trembling, not in fear, but in patience. The pastor's voice thundered again. "If anyone here wants to defend this book, be my guest." He grinned, certain no one would dare. Then, a hand went up. The crowd turned. A girl stood. There was a pause long enough for the tension to wrap around every breath in the room. The pastor squinted. "You," he chuckled. "You want to speak for Islam?" Fatima stepped forward, her voice clear. "I don't speak for Islam," she said, "but I will speak the truth if you'll let me." The room went silent, and in that silence something began to shift, because this was no longer just a performance. This was the beginning of something no one saw coming. For a moment, the room was suspended in disbelief. A teenage girl, barely 5'3", wrapped in a clean white hijab, had just stood to respond to a man twice her age with a platform 100 times louder. The tension snapped as the pastor chuckled into the mic. "A brave soul," he said, eyes twinkling with mockery. Let's laughter rippled through the crowd. Some whispered. A few even pulled out their phones, expecting an awkward collapse. But Fatima didn't shrink. She stepped toward the stage slowly, each footstep deliberate. The moderator hesitated, then nodded. A handheld mic was offered to her. She took it politely and turned to the audience, not with fire, but with calm. "My name is Fatima Noor." She began, voice steady. "I didn't come here to debate. But when I heard the Quran misquoted, I couldn't stay silent." Some of the laughter faded, not out of shame, but curiosity. Fatima held up her pocket. "Quran, the verse you read, sir," she said gently, "was from Surah At-Tawbah. You mentioned it as proof of violence, but you didn't mention the verse before it or after." She opened the book and read aloud. "But if they repent and establish prayer and give zakah, then let them go their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful." 5, then she added, "And the next verse says, and if any of the polytheists seek your protection, then grant him protection so that he may hear the words of Allah, then deliver him to his place of safety." 9, 6, she looked up. "Does that sound like a religion of aggression or mercy?" A ripple moved through the audience. The pastor, slightly caught off guard, adjusted his collar. "Well, young lady, that's one interpretation." "No, sir," Fatima replied respectfully. "That's the full text. There's a difference." Now the room was paying attention. "The Quran doesn't teach blanket violence," she continued. "It speaks of self-defense in context of war, after Muslims were exiled, attacked, and betrayed. Just like the Bible has verses revealed in times of conflict, she paused, then said gently, "Would it be fair for someone to read the Bible's verses on stoning or war and use them to say Christianity promotes violence?" The question hung in the air. Even the pastor didn't immediately respond. Fatima turned to the crowd. "When we isolate verses, we weaponize scripture. But when we understand context, we find something deeper: guidance, not hate." One woman near the front crossed her arms, but nodded slowly. Another older man leaned back in his seat, blinking as if reprocessing what he thought he knew. The pastor tried to pivot. "What about women? Islam treats them as second-class citizens. That's in the Quran, isn't it?" Fatima didn't flinch. She smiled softly. "Then let's talk about women." She opened the Quran again. "And for women are rights similar to those of men with fairness." Tikkun 2:28. "Paradise lies at the feet of your mother." Hadith, "Do not inherit women against their will." 4:19. She closed the book gently. "My hijab doesn't oppress me, it protects me. My religion doesn't silence me, it dignifies me. You assumed I was weak because I'm young, but Islam taught me to speak the truth even when my voice trembles." Now the crowd was completely still. Even the pastor was quiet because this girl wasn't debating anymore. She was revealing something many had never truly seen: Islam, not as headlines or hearsay, but as it really is. Reverend Mason Cole wasn't used to silence, especially not silence like this. He had led countless services, debates, and panels where his voice was the final one in the room, the loudest, the cleverest, the most certain. But now a teenage girl with a calm voice and a Quran in her hand had interrupted his momentum, and worse, stirred something in the crowd he couldn't control. He cleared his throat and leaned back into the mic, his tone slightly sharpened. "I admire your poise, Fatima," he said, voice steady but forced. "But quoting a few pleasant verses doesn't erase the darker teachings in that book. Let's not play the cherry-picking game." A few in the crowd nodded. Fatima didn't take the bait. "I agree," she said gently, "which is why I quoted the full passage, not part of it, not out of context. Would you like me to do the same for the verses you didn't finish?" There was a pause, a subtle tension in the room. "Let's be real," the pastor pressed. "Islam spread by the sword. It conquered, divided, and forced its way through lands. The Prophet Muhammad married many women. Are we supposed to believe this is the model of mercy?" This time a few gasps rose. Some leaned back uncomfortable. Others watched Fatima, wondering if she'd crack. She didn't. "My prophet," she began, "forgave the people who tortured him. He refused to curse them, even when he had the power. He led armies only when his people were expelled, attacked, and betrayed. Islam did not spread through violence, it spread through justice, fairness, and a book that softened even the hardest of hearts." She looked directly at Reverend Cole. As for his marriages, they were not scandals, they were acts of compassion. He married widows, older women, and created ties between tribes. Not one woman ever accused him of cruelty, and every word he spoke about marriage is still honored in our homes today. The room fell quiet again, but Fatima didn't stop. "You call Islam oppressive to women," she said. "But tell me what other scripture told men, 400 years ago, to honor women, educate daughters, and treat wives with kindness as a divine command." The pastor opened his mouth but hesitated. He hadn't expected depth, he'd prepared for deflection. Fatima's tone softened. "I was raised in this country. I've seen what it means when a girl is judged by how much she reveals, not how much she thinks. I found strength in my faith, not shame." Now the tension wasn't directed at Fatima. It hovered over the pastor and he felt it. He adjusted the cuffs on his shirt. "If Islam is so peaceful," he said, trying one last time, "why are there so many extremists in the world? Why are Muslim lands full of conflict?" Fatima paused, then spoke with clarity. "Because the world doesn't judge Christianity by what the KKK did, or by what violent crusaders did. It separates the faith from the actions of those who abuse it." She stepped forward. "Do the same for us." No one clapped. No one moved. But hearts were shifting. Because Reverend Cole, for the first time in the evening, didn't have a rebuttal. He had a realization that maybe he hadn't come here to defend truth. Maybe he had come to hear it. Reverend Cole stood frozen, hands still resting on the podium. But his voice had left him. His polished composure, the charisma, the bite. The rhythm was crumbling under the weight of something unfamiliar. Conviction. Fatima's words hadn't been sharp. They hadn't been loud. But they had landed like truth always does, quietly, deeply, and inescapably. And then she did something unexpected. She stopped addressing him. She turned to the audience. "I want to tell you something personal," she said, her voice tender. "When I was younger, I struggled with identity. I wore this hijab for the first time at 12. On the first day, a boy in school called me a terrorist. Others laughed. I went home and cried for hours. The room listened, still solemn. I asked my mother why Allah gave us a religion that made us so hated. She took my hand, opened the Quran, and read this verse. 'We did not send you, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to all the worlds.'" 21:107. Fatima's eyes welled slightly. She told me, "You're not hated because of your faith, Fatima. You're hated because people don't know your faith." She looked up, eyes scanning the crowd. "That day I stopped wearing hijab out of fear and started wearing it out of love." A hush wrapped the room like a blanket. Even those who had come only to observe now sat straighter, eyes glassy. "The Quran didn't shame me," she continued. "It rescued me. It gave me dignity in a world that wanted to define me by beauty or silence. It taught me that submission to God is not weakness, it's the foundation of strength." She turned slowly toward Reverend Cole again. "You mock this book, Reverend, but you never really met it." He blinked. She opened her Quran once more and read softly, "And do not argue with the people of the book except in the best manner, unless it is with those who do wrong. Say, we believe in what has been revealed to us and to you. Our God and your God is one, and to him we submit." 20:29-46. The words hung like a prayer. Reverend Cole's hand slowly dropped from the podium. He looked not at Fatima, but at the Quran in her hands. His jaw clenched, not in anger, but in uncertainty. For a brief second, the mask slipped, and that's when the crack appeared. A twitch of his lip, a narrowing of the eyes, a step backward. His voice, when it finally emerged, came not from his throat, but from something deeper and far less stable. "I didn't expect that," he murmured. Someone in the front row whispered, "Subhanallah," another person. An elderly Christian woman with silver hair began quietly weeping. Fatima nodded gently. "I didn't come to win a debate, Reverend. I came to speak on behalf of a book that has never failed me. Even when people have." She closed the Quran, pressed it softly to her chest, and stepped back. No applause, no shouts, just silence. And the faint sound of something invisible breaking, perhaps pride, perhaps prejudice, or maybe the wall between ignorance and understanding. The silence that followed Fatima's words was different than before. It wasn't the awkward pause of uncertainty or the respectful stillness of listening. It was something sacred, something weighty. The kind of silence that only happens when people are collectively holding their breath. Reverend Cole stared down at the podium. He wasn't looking at Fatima anymore. He was looking at his notes, pages filled with pre-selected verses, printed headlines, and emotionally charged talking points. His arsenal of proof had felt convincing just an hour ago. Now they felt hollow, stage small. He glanced at the crowd. They were no longer leaning toward him. Their eyes were on Fatima, some wide with awe, others wet with emotion. He had lost them, but more than that, he was starting to feel he had lost himself. Still, the ego doesn't die quietly. He straightened his back and leaned into the mic once more. "I'm sure your experience is meaningful," he said carefully. "But let's not forget, people have experiences in every religion. Conviction doesn't make something true. Emotion isn't evidence." A few heads nodded. Fatima, undisturbed, took a small step forward. "You're right, Reverend," she said gently. "Emotion isn't proof, but it reveals something deeper, sincerity." She held up her Quran again, her fingers resting lightly on the pages. "Do you know why this book changed me?" she asked the room. "Because it didn't ask me to worship Muhammad. It didn't ask me to chase saints or rituals. It asked me to recognize my Creator and submit to Him alone." She turned her gaze back to the pastor. "And you say the Quran can't be true because I feel connected to it. But have you asked why it reaches hearts that have nothing left?" She paused. "If this book were false, why does it give peace to the broken, hope to the abandoned, strength to the voiceless?" A beat of silence passed. Then she added, when war displaced my cousins, they had nothing, not food, not shelter, but they had this book, and they still found joy, still praised God, still forgave. How do you explain that? Reverend Cole didn't answer. She walked slowly to the edge of the stage. Her final words came with the clarity of glass and the weight of iron. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and if we're too proud, we miss it. She stepped back, handed the mic to the moderator, and returned to her seat. No victory dance, no triumphant smirk, just peace. The pastor was left standing alone. The crowd now stared at him. Not in anger, not in mockery, but in expectation. Waiting to see what he would do next. He opened his mouth once, closed it, then almost reluctantly whispered into the mic, "I don't know what to say." He turned slightly toward Fatima. "You've spoken beautifully." She nodded politely but said nothing more. And in that moment, for the first time in his long, confident career, Reverend Mason Cole found himself face to face with something he couldn't out-talk or out-argue. Truth spoken, not with force, but with faith. The church was silent, but not the kind of silence people were used to in that space. It wasn't reverent like a Sunday morning sermon, nor tense like a theological standoff. It was stunned, still almost sacred. A stillness thick with realization, as if the entire room was catching its breath together. Reverend Mason Cole remained standing at the podium, his notes forgotten. His gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the stained glass windows above the microphone picked up the faint rustle of his jacket as he adjusted it more from nerves than comfort. He looked out into the crowd. These were his people, the congregants who had cheered his fiery sermons, applauded his debates, reposted his videos. But now they sat wordless, watching a girl in hijab with reverence usually reserved for the pulpit. A voice broke the silence. Not his Fatima stood again, not to debate, not to argue, but to finish what she began. She opened the Quran gently and read, "Call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction, and argue with them in a way that is best." Quran 16, 125. Then she closed the book softly and said, "That's how Islam taught me to speak with truth and grace, not mockery." She looked at Reverend Cole. "And I hope after today you'll read the Quran again, not with the intention to refute, but to understand." Her voice didn't shake. Her tone didn't rise. It simply landed. Cole swallowed hard. For a moment he looked down at the Bible on his podium, then at the Quran in Fatima's hands. "You know," he said quietly, almost to himself, "I've spent years speaking about Islam, but I don't think I've ever really listened to it." He turned to the audience. "I owe all of you honesty. I mocked what I didn't truly know. I stood on this stage confident that I was defending truth. But now," he paused. His hands tightened slightly on the podium. "Now I think truth may be broader than I allowed it to be." A woman in the third pew covered her mouth, eyes glistening. A man near the back closed his Bible not out of protest, but reflection. Cole looked at Fatima again. "I may not agree with everything, but I'll say this today: I saw something real, something sincere, and I can't walk away from that unchanged." The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't clap. They just sat quietly absorbing a moment that no one had come expecting. A moment that had turned into a turning point. After a pause, the event moderator finally stepped forward. Voice unsure but sincere. "Thank you, Reverend, and thank you, Fatima. I think we've all witnessed something very different tonight." And that was it. No official conclusion, no call to prayer, no altar moment, just a stillness that said everything. As people slowly began to rise from their seats, there were no harsh debates or whispered criticism. Instead, there were quiet nods, tearful glances, people shaking Fatima's hand. A young Christian woman approached her and said, "You didn't just defend your faith, you made me curious about mine." And as Reverend Cole stepped off the stage, he looked at the Quran on Fatima's chair one last time. He didn't pick it up, but he didn't walk past it either. He stood there, just long enough for everyone to understand something had changed. The evening air outside the church was cooler than expected. A small group had gathered in clusters, whispering, reflecting. No one was rushing home. Something unspoken lingered, an invisible weight of truth that refused to fade. Inside, the auditorium had mostly emptied, but near the front row, Fatima remained seated, her Quran resting in her lap. her fingers gently tracing the edge of the cover. She wasn't basking in victory. She was simply grateful. She had only planned to sit and observe. She hadn't imagined she would speak, but Allah had guided her voice, and now her heart was still. Reverend Cole emerged from a side hallway, his coat folded over one arm. No entourage, no camera crew, just him. He approached slowly. Fatima looked up and offered a quiet smile. He stopped in front of her. "May I sit?" She nodded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "When I was a seminary student, I read a verse from Proverbs. A gentle answer turns away wrath. I used to believe that meant softening my anger." He looked at her, but tonight I saw it in a different way. You were the gentle answer, and it turned away something I didn't even know was inside me. Fatima looked at him, her voice soft. "Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs a heart that's ready." He nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology. Not for the debate, but for the arrogance. I thought I was here to teach. But today, I learned something instead." Fatima gently offered him the Quran from her lap. "This is for you," she said. "Not for a speech, just to read when you're alone." Reverend Cole hesitated, then took it with both hands, carefully, respectfully. "I promise," he whispered, "I won't mock it again." At that moment, the moderator re-entered to wrap up, but he stopped at the sight. The Reverend and the girl seated together, heads bowed, not in confrontation, but in conversation. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd softened. A young man who had come with doubts approached a Muslim attendee and asked for a copy of the Quran. Another woman whispered through tears, "She reminded me why I believed in God at all." Later that night, the church's social media team uploaded a quiet photo, Fatima handing the Quran to Reverend Cole. No caption, just the image. Within hours, it went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Across comment sections and forums, people wrote things like, "This changed my view of Islam completely. That girl, she didn't debate. She awakened something. We need more Fatimas in the world." And somewhere in a quiet room, Reverend Cole sat alone. The Quran now open on his desk. The first chapter, Al-Fatiha, in translation before him. He read the words slowly, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, guide us to the straight path." His lips didn't move, but his heart listened, because sometimes a single voice, spoken in truth, in sincerity and calm, can do what a lifetime of sermons never could. It can awaken the soul, and all it takes is one spark of humility. This story teaches us that truth does not need to shout, it only needs to be spoken with sincerity. In a world driven by loud voices, quick judgments, and social media mockery. A Christian pastor mocked the Quran, then this girl spoke reminds us that dignity, humility, and knowledge can disarm even the most aggressive critic. Fatima didn't argue to win. She didn't retaliate with anger. She responded with calm confidence rooted in the Quran and personal conviction. Her strength came not from volume, but from clarity. In life, we're often tempted to respond to hostility with hostility. But this story shows that the most powerful rebuttal is truth delivered with grace. Whether you are Muslim or not, the lesson is universal. You don't have to be the loudest to be heard, you just need to be sincere. When facing ignorance or hate, respond not with ego, but with wisdom. Speak not to defeat someone, but to awaken something within them. In a time when misinformation spreads faster than understanding, be the voice that reflects light, not heat, and always remember sometimes the quietest words are the ones that echo the longest in people's hearts. He came to destroy Islam in front of thousands armed with questions, sarcasm, and a camera crew ready to capture another viral takedown. The crowd cheered, waiting for the Muslim side to collapse. But what no one expected was that a quiet 17-year-old Muslim boy would stand up. No shouting, no debate tricks, just truth. And one by one, his answers began to unravel the influencer's confidence, until the man who came to expose Islam found himself questioning everything he believed. What did the boy say that left a grown man speechless and turned an audience of critics into listeners? You're about to witness the moment arrogance bowed to sincerity. If your heart is ready for the truth, press 1 to begin. The lights inside the Manhattan Cultural Forum blazed like a stage set for battle. Nearly every seat in the auditorium was filled. Teenagers, university students, content creators, and influencers. All had come for one reason: to watch Caleb Burns do what he did best: shred ideologies on stage. He was bold, sarcastic, and unapologetically loud. A viral YouTuber turned truth debater, known for ambushing religious people with aggressive street interviews. And tonight he had come prepared. The banners read, "Truth Clash, is Islam defendable?" He'd spent weeks crafting questions meant to embarrass anyone brave or foolish enough to speak for Islam. As he walked onto the stage dressed in a sharp black hoodie and a smug grin, the audience erupted. Caleb raised his mic dramatically. "All right, let's not waste time," he said, pacing. "Is there anyone here who dares defend Islam? I've got 10 questions, real ones. And trust me, Google won't save you." Silence, a few laughs. Someone whispered, "No one's coming." Then from the third row a figure stood. A boy, slim-build, modest clothes, maybe 17. Calm eyes, no phone in hand, no group around him. "Just a presence, I'll answer," he said simply. Caleb blinked. "You?" The crowd laughed, but Zayd didn't. He just stepped forward, and with that single step, the entire atmosphere began to shift. Zayd's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor of the auditorium as he approached the stage. The crowd watched in disbelief, murmurs rolling like static through the room. Some smirked, others leaned forward intrigued. This boy, barely 17, in a plain gray hoodie and worn sneakers, was going to defend one of the world's most misunderstood religions, against a man who had humiliated dozens before him. Caleb crossed his arms, leaning on the edge of the podium. "You sure you're ready for this, kid?" he said with a chuckle. "This isn't TikTok wisdom, I came prepared." Zayd stood tall, hands by his sides, eyes calm. "Truth doesn't need a stage to stand on," he replied, "but I'm here, so ask." The room hushed. Caleb's grin tightened. "All right then," he said, holding up a printed sheet. "Question 1. If Islam is a religion of peace, why does your book talk about violence, about fighting, about war? Shouldn't peace mean peace?" The crowd leaned in. Caleb's voice was confident, but Zayd didn't blink. "Peace," Zayd began, "isn't the absence of war, it's the presence of justice. The Quran does mention fighting, but only when Muslims were attacked, tortured, expelled from their homes. It commands self-defense, not aggression." He paused, and when the Prophet had full power, when he entered Mecca with thousands behind him, he forgave his enemies. No blood, no revenge. That's not just peace, that's mercy. A few heads in the crowd nodded. The tension cracked slightly. Caleb's brow furrowed. "Fine," he said, "but let's talk about women. Why do Muslim women have to cover themselves? Why can't they be free like everyone else?" Zayd didn't rush. Freedom isn't about removing cloth, it's about choice. Islam gives guidelines not to restrict but to dignify. The hijab isn't about shame, it's about identity. He looked toward the crowd. And if oppression is measured by appearance, then why do thousands of educated Muslim women proudly wear it, even in places where they're mocked for it? This time the silence was heavier. A few women in the audience exchanged glances. One lowered her head, visibly moved. Caleb cleared his throat. "Okay, then explain this. How can a man from the 7th century write a book that claims to be divine?" Zayd smiled for the first time. "He couldn't," he said softly. Caleb blinked. "Come again, he couldn't," Zayd repeated. "The Quran challenges mankind to produce even one chapter like it. It speaks of the expanding universe, the development of the embryo, the layers of the ocean. Facts no one in the desert could have known." He looked at Caleb. "A man didn't write it, God revealed it." A stillness swept across the auditorium. The laughter had long faded. Zayd wasn't reacting. He was revealing. His tone never rose. His body never tensed. He didn't argue, he clarified. And in doing so, the audience, once eager for a show, began to feel something different. Conviction. Caleb leaned back. His jaw tightened, fingers drumming on the table. Zayd took a breath. "You came to expose Islam," he said quietly. "But Islam has never hidden. It's always been open. What it exposes is our intentions." The words hit like thunder in the stillness. No claps, no noise, just silence and the slow unraveling of a man who had always thought he held the mic. Caleb looked down at his sheet. For the first time in his career, the questions no longer felt like weapons. They felt like mirrors. The silence was louder than the laughter had been. Zayd stepped up onto the platform. No stage lights or microphone adjustments needed. Just him, the crowd, and the weight of what he'd just volunteered for. His hands were steady at his sides. His shoulders weren't squared in pride, but in sincerity. Caleb turned slowly toward him, clearly amused. "You sure about this?" he asked, smirking. "You're just a kid." "This isn't your high school debate club." Zayd met his gaze unfazed. "And truth doesn't care about age." A few people in the back chuckled, but it wasn't mockery anymore. It was disbelief wrapped in curiosity. Caleb cleared his throat theatrically and unfolded a paper from his back pocket. "All right," he said into the mic. "Let's start simple. Question 1, if Islam is the religion of peace, why did your prophet fight wars? Why does your holy book talk about violence? Doesn't that sound like divine hypocrisy?" The crowd leaned in, anticipating hesitation, but Zayd didn't flinch. "Fighting isn't the absence of peace," he said calmly. "It's a defense of peace when it's under attack. The Quran never commands Muslims to spread religion by force. It only permits battle when lives, homes, and dignity are under threat." He glanced across the room, and even then it tells Muslims if they incline toward peace, then you must also incline toward it. That's in Surah Al-Anfal, verse 61. A hush rippled through the audience. Caleb raised an eyebrow thrown off by the confident citation. "Fine," he said, waving it off. "Let's talk about freedom, women in Islam. Why do they cover themselves? Isn't hijab a symbol of oppression?" Zayd smiled gently. "Depends on how you define freedom," he said. "If freedom is being judged by how little skin you show, then no Muslim women aren't free in that way. But if freedom means being respected for your mind instead of your body, then hijab is liberation." He paused. "Real oppression," he added, "is when a woman has to strip down just to feel seen." Several heads in the audience turned toward one another. The energy was shifting, slowly, deeply. Caleb tapped his card again, this time with more tension than before. "Your prophet, he was illiterate. How could a man who couldn't read or write produce something as complex as the Quran? That book must have been copied or created by others." Zayd's tone didn't change. "Exactly," he said, "he was illiterate. That's the miracle." Caleb stared, not understanding. Zayd explained, "How could a man with no formal education speak for 23 years, delivering a message so linguistically perfect, scientifically accurate, and spiritually timeless? Without divine help?" He leaned forward, voice soft but firm. "He couldn't. That's why the Quran is not the word of Muhammad. It's the word of Allah." This time the crowd didn't laugh. They didn't even breathe. Caleb's shoulders stiffened. He was losing the crowd, and he knew it. His eyes scanned his notes, hoping the next question would flip the script. But before he could read it aloud, Zayd spoke first. "You came to expose Islam," he said gently. "But maybe Islam is here to expose something too." Caleb looked up, startled. "Not you," Zayd clarified. "Your questions, your assumptions, your pain." There was no aggression in his voice, no sarcasm, just sincerity. The kind of sincerity that bypasses defenses and speaks directly to the soul. And for the first time in his public career, Caleb Burns felt the debate slipping not into chaos, but into truth. Caleb stared down at his notes, but the paper might as well have been blank. His plan had been simple: overwhelm his opponent with sarcasm, corner them with gotcha questions, and ride the wave of crowd laughter all the way to another viral victory. But now the crowd wasn't laughing. They were listening. Zayd had done something Caleb didn't expect. He'd answered with calm, not combat. And worse for Caleb, at least his words made sense. "Let's, move on," Caleb said, forcing a grin. He lifted his next question, but avoided Zayd's eyes. "If Islam believes in one God, then why does the Quran say, 'We created man'? Isn't that polytheism in disguise?" Zayd didn't even blink. In Arabic and in many ancient Semitic languages, kings and rulers use the plural form to express majesty, not number. It's called the royal we. It's not a contradiction, it's reverence. He paused just long enough. The Torah uses the same structure when referring to God. He added, "So if you have a problem with the Quran's use of we, you might want to recheck your own scripture." The audience stirred. Even a few of Caleb's loyal supporters shifted in their seats, unsure of what side they were on anymore. Caleb's smirk began to twitch. His showman energy was slipping. His voice, usually so sharp and certain, sounded more like a question than a statement. "Okay then, what about salvation?" he blurted. "In Christianity, salvation comes through grace, through the sacrifice of Jesus. What does Islam offer? Rules, laws, fear?" Zayd took a quiet breath. "Islam offers accountability," he said, "but also mercy more than we deserve. Allah says in the Quran, 'My mercy encompasses all things.' We don't need a blood sacrifice to be forgiven. We need sincerity, repentance, and effort." He looked Caleb directly in the eyes. "Why would God need to kill someone to forgive you, when he could just choose to forgive?" Silence, Caleb swallowed. For years he had painted Islam as rigid, dry, joyless. But here was a teenage boy speaking of Islam as something profoundly human, something rooted in mercy, depth, and reason, and the crowd could feel it. A few people in the back wiped tears. One woman covered her mouth, visibly emotional. Then Zayd said something that broke the silence completely. "Islam doesn't ask you to blindly follow. It invites you to think, reflect, and seek. That's why the Quran keeps asking, will they not use their minds?" He wasn't preaching, he was planting seeds. And everyone in that hall knew, Caleb most of all, that something had shifted. The debate was no longer about religion, it was about ego, about what you do when your assumptions start falling apart in front of your own eyes. Caleb tried one more time to gather control. "So you're telling me," he said, "that all these scholars, all these philosophers, all these scientists who reject Islam, they're all wrong?" Zayd smiled, not with mockery but with calm compassion. "No," he said, "I'm saying that even the smartest minds can miss the truth when their hearts are closed," and that was it. The final crack. Because for all his charisma and preparation, Caleb wasn't prepared for truth without arrogance. He wasn't prepared for a teenager who didn't want to win, just to be sincere. And deep down he knew he hadn't come to expose Islam. Islam had come to expose him. The crowd wasn't cheering anymore. They weren't even moving. It was as if every person in that auditorium had become afraid to breathe, worried that any sound might break the strange, sacred stillness that had settled over the room. The debate stage, once a place of performance and pride, now felt more like a place of reckoning. Caleb stood still, eyes darting across the faces watching him. Their expressions were no longer entertained. They were engaged, some curious, some shaken. A few even moved. And then he realized something terrifying. They weren't waiting for him to win. They were waiting to see if he would listen. Zayd stood silently across from him. His posture hadn't changed. Neither had his tone. There was no gloating, no smirk, just patience. A kind of strength that didn't need to be loud. Caleb cleared his throat and tried to summon fire again. "All right," he said, forcing a smile. "If Islam really is the truth, why hasn't God just made it obvious? Why doesn't he show himself? Why play hide and seek with humanity?" Zayd stepped closer to the mic. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. "Can you stare at the sun for more than a few seconds?" he asked softly. Caleb blinked, thrown off. "No," he muttered. "Why?" Zayd looked at him gently. "Then how could you stare at the creator of the sun? We can't even bear the brightness of his creations. Imagine the majesty of the one who made them." Gasps, a soft wave of murmurs washed through the audience. Zayd continued, "God doesn't hide. His signs are everywhere in the skies, in your soul, in every breath you take. But he won't force you to believe. He respects your choice. He waits for your heart to want the truth." Caleb's hands fell to his sides. The paper he had once clutched like a sword now looked like a crumpled, useless page. His questions had been answered, but more importantly, his assumptions had been exposed. He looked down at his shoes. For a moment he didn't speak. Then quietly, almost to himself, he said, "I don't know what to say." Zayd stepped closer, not to confront him, but to meet him where he was. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Sometimes silence means your heart is finally listening." Tears welled in a young woman's eyes in the second row. A boy next to her whispered, "Subhanallah," under his breath. The cameraman who had been filming this entire event for Caleb's YouTube channel zoomed out slowly, capturing not a clash, but a calm. Caleb looked up again. His voice cracked when he asked, How do you know all this? You're just 17. Zayd smiled faintly. Because I stopped asking how to defeat people and started asking how to find the truth. And that truth right now was no longer defending itself. It was speaking through a teenage boy with no stage experience, no theological degree, and no agenda, except sincerity. Caleb turned to the crowd hoping to regain his strength, but instead he saw faces reflecting what he feared most. Empathy, understanding, even admiration. For the one he had planned to humiliate, his knees felt weak. He stepped back from the mic, and for the first time in his career, not as a showman, but as a man, he whispered to no one in particular. What if I've been wrong this whole time? No one answered because the answer had already been given, not by argument but by truth. The silence stretched, but no one dared to break it. Caleb stood with his back to the crowd, his breathing uneven. The confident stance was gone. His notes, once a shield, now hung limply at his side. On the other end of the stage, Zayd remained still, as if waiting not for applause but for something deeper. A voice suddenly rose from the audience. It was an older man in the third row, dressed in a brown overcoat. "Let the boy finish," he said softly. "Let him speak his heart." All eyes turned to Zayd. He stepped toward the center of the stage, not with arrogance but with grace. "I didn't come here to win," he began, voice clear. "I didn't come here to make anyone look small. I came here because Islam has been misrepresented. And sometimes, the loudest lies are the ones who've spoken with confidence." He looked gently toward Caleb, who was now facing him again, eyes glistening with something neither man nor crowd expected: humility. "People think Islam is a religion of force," Zayd continued. "But Allah says in the Quran, there is no compulsion in religion. You can't force belief, it has to come from the heart." A girl in the audience whispered, "I've never heard it said like that before." Zayd turned slightly, addressing everyone. Now the Prophet Muhammad was offered power, wealth, and women if he would just stop preaching Islam. But he said, "Even if you put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I will never give up this message." He didn't want power, he wanted hearts to awaken. The auditorium was utterly still. Caleb, his voice low, finally asked, "So why did you accept this debate?" Zayd looked at him. "Because I knew you weren't my enemy. You were just searching, like all of us." Caleb's face broke. His lips trembled. He looked down at his shoes as if ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. "I was raised thinking Islam was the problem," he said. "Every video I made, every comment section, I thought I was defending truth. But now," he shook his head, "I'm not even sure what I was defending." A young man in the back stood up. "Neither was I," he said boldly. "I came here to cheer Caleb on. But this kid just answered questions I've had for years." Others began nodding. "I only came because my friend dragged me," a woman admitted aloud. "But now, I want to learn more." Murmurs turned to movement. People stood, some in reflection, some in reverence. And for a moment, the debate stage became something else entirely. A place of awakening. Caleb turned back to Zayd. "What happens now?" he asked, not with sarcasm but sincerity. Zayd didn't answer. Instead, an elderly man from the Muslim section of the audience stepped forward, bearded, soft-eyed, and wrapped in a long gray shawl. "If your heart is opening," the old man said to Caleb, "then take your time. Ask, read, pray. Allah is never far from the one who seeks him." Caleb nodded slowly, tears now falling freely. "I don't know if I'm ready yet, but I want to understand." Zayd smiled, voice steady. "That's all it takes." And in that sacred pause, with no camera script, no viral punchline, the real story unfolded, not of humiliation, but of transformation. Because one young Muslim didn't try to defeat a man, he tried to reach him. And he did. The debate was over, but no one moved, not the moderator, not the crowd, not even the camera still rolling. Because what had just taken place on that stage wasn't a competition. It was a turning point. A boy had spoken, a man had been moved, and a room full of hardened assumptions had quietly begun to soften. Caleb sat at the edge of the stage, now legs dangling, staring at the floor like it held answers. Around him, strangers spoke in hushed tones, Not about who won, but about what they felt. Zayd sat beside him, not as a victor, but as a brother. "I used to think Islam was about rules and punishments," Caleb said, almost whispering. "But everything you said, it felt different. Like it wasn't about control, it was about clarity." Zayd nodded. "Islam isn't just a religion," he said. "It's a reminder of who we are and why we're here. That life is a test and truth is a mercy." A small group had gathered near the front, young men and women from different backgrounds. Some were visibly emotional. One girl wiped her tears before asking gently, "Why have we never heard Islam explained like this?" An older Muslim woman in a hijab stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Because too many people speak about Islam with anger," she said, "but real dawah is spoken from love." More nods, more silence. Hearts weren't just listening, they were waking up. Caleb slowly stood and turned to face the audience again. His voice cracked. "I mocked Muslims for years. I thought they followed blindly. But now I see some of them follow with more awareness, more depth than I've ever had." A few claps emerged, not loud, not celebratory, but reverent. A kind of emotional applause. Then someone called out, "Will you become Muslim?" Caleb paused, the room holding its breath. "I'm not ready to say that yet," he said honestly. "But for the first time, I want to learn. Not just debate, I want to understand before I judge." That was enough. Zayd smiled, and the old imam from earlier returned to gently place a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Allah guides hearts in his time," he said, "and the door remains open." As the event wrapped, people didn't rush for exits. Instead, they formed small circles asking questions, sharing reflections. Some Muslim youth, inspired by Zayd's courage, began discussing how they too could answer doubts at school and online. One Christian girl quietly approached Zayd. "I'm not Muslim," she said, "but today you made me see Islam with new eyes." Zayd offered no speech, just a nod and a warm, sincere smile. By the time the hall finally began to empty, the sun was setting outside. Its golden light streamed through the lobby windows, casting long shadows and soft glows across people's faces. Zayd walked out into the evening air alone, his hands in his pockets. No entourage, no press, just peace. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't insulted, he hadn't even tried to win. He just spoke the truth. And truth, when spoken with humility, doesn't need to be forced. It finds its way. As he reached the sidewalk, Zayd glanced up at the sky, now painted in hues of orange and deep blue. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Ya Allah, guide them as you guided me." Behind him, the echoes of one night still lingered, but ahead of him was something more powerful. The ripple of a heart awakened, and the quiet, unstoppable spread of light. This story teaches us that truth doesn't always need to roar. To be heard, sometimes it only needs to be spoken with sincerity. In a world obsessed with winning arguments, going viral, and proving others wrong, this narrative reminds us that hearts are not changed by volume, but by integrity. Zayd, a teenager with no platform or fame, stood firm not to humiliate or dominate, but to clarify, to humanize, and to invite his calmness in the face of mockery and his refusal to fight fire. With fire exposed something deeper, that true conviction is rooted in humility, not arrogance. Caleb's transformation shows us that even the most hardened skeptics can be moved not by facts alone, but by the way those facts are delivered. In our lives, we often come across moments where we can choose to react or to respond with ego or with empathy. This story reminds us to choose the latter, because when truth is shared with compassion, it doesn't just win debates, it changes lives. We should all strive to be like Zayd, courageous, respectful, and grounded. Not because we want to be seen as right, but because we want others to see what's truly right. A world-famous rabbi fell to his knees because of a barefoot child. It wasn't a war zone. It wasn't a protest. It was a debate inside a grand cathedral in Europe. The audience expected fireworks, a proud rabbi ready to expose Islam, tear down the Quran, and silence every Muslim voice in the room. But then something no one expected happened. A 13-year-old Palestinian refugee stood up. No notes, no shoes, no fear. And in just a few minutes, this child delivered words so pure, so devastatingly truthful. The rabbi couldn't speak. He broke down in front of everyone, weeping, whispering, "I never knew this. Was Islam?" What did the boy say? Press 1 and witness the moment ego shattered and truth stood alone. The chandeliers glowed above marble floors, casting golden halos across the vast hall of St. Marie Cathedral, a sacred space long since converted into a European cultural. That evening, it was filled to capacity. Hundreds sat in velvet chairs, dignitaries and journalists alike. Cameras lined the back wall. Security stood by, crisp and still. The event was billed as Brid. At the center stood Rabbi Eliam, Rosen, dignified, precise, and deeply respected. A towering figure in Jewish scholarship, he was known for both his intellect and his unapologetic stance on religious truth. Dressed in a black robe and deep blue kippah, he adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room with authority. His lecture had stirred polite applause, but tension lingered. He had spoken about the prophets, about Torah, about the lineage of truth, and then carefully, calculatedly, he had questioned the legitimacy of Islam's connection to Abraham, calling it the youngest sibling in a house it barely understands. Some gasped, some nodded, a few gripped their pens, waiting for the response, but none came until the final segment. Audience dialogue. The moderator, a French professor in a gray suit, opened the floor. That's when a soft voice filtered through a translator's headset asked, "May I speak?" All heads turned. It came from the far back row, a young boy no older than 13, sitting beside a quiet man with worn shoes and a hospital wristband still around his arm. The boy stood slowly, thin, barefoot, a simple keffiyeh wrapped around his neck, eyes dark and steady. His name, later revealed, was Yasin. "A refugee," someone whispered. A few chuckled under their breath. The moderator hesitated, but the rabbi nodded. "Let him speak," he said, with the same confidence of a man unafraid of a child's question. Yasin stepped forward, each step silent yet full of weight. He reached the front with no papers, no entourage, just truth in his chest and tears that hadn't yet fallen. And in that moment, no one knew. This was not just the closing of a panel. It was the opening of hearts. The audience watched with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and pity as Yasin stepped up to the single microphone placed at the edge of the stage. It stood taller than him. A stagehand moved to adjust it, but Yasin shook his head gently. He didn't need amplification. His presence was already louder than words. The moderator leaned forward. "Please, young man, your name and question?" Yasin's accent was soft, his French tinged with Arabic warmth. "My name is Yasin. I come from Gaza." He paused, his eyes moving gently across the faces before him. "And I have no question, I have a message." The audience rustled, cameras clicked. The rabbi folded his arms, amused but attentive. "I have heard you speak of Abraham." Yasin began, "of his covenant, of his children. You say that Islam is the youngest sibling, undeserving of the inheritance." He took a breath. "But we all come from one house, and sometimes it's the youngest child who still remembers how the home used to feel before it was broken." The room fell still. "I am not here to argue. I am not a scholar. I am a child who has seen war, who has lost a father, who has lived beneath rubble and silence. But in the Quran, I found something I never saw in missiles or headlines." He reached into his pocket and unfolded a worn page. It says, "And do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just, that is nearer to righteousness." Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:8. The rabbi's fingers stopped drumming on his sleeve. Yasin looked directly at him now. "You said Islam does not understand Abraham, but Ibrahim alayhi salam was not born into privilege. He was cast into fire. He was isolated, mocked, nearly sacrificed his son because he submitted to one God." He pointed gently to the sky. "That same God gave us the same message. And whether you call him Elohim or Allah, he still hears the cries of a boy who prays for the one who questions his faith." Someone in the front row gasped quietly. Rabbi Eliam cleared his throat. His jaw had tensed, but his posture didn't change. "Do you believe, young man, that your pain gives you authority to teach a rabbi?" Yasin shook his head. "No, sir. My pain does not teach, but it makes me listen." He looked down for a moment, then up again. When my house collapsed, my mother said something I will never forget. She said, "Yasin, do not let your heart collapse too. Allah will rebuild both." And he did not with bricks, but with truth. Silence raw, real reverent. Even the moderator looked unsure how to continue. Yasin turned back toward the audience. We were not made to inherit arguments, we were made to inherit mercy. And if the covenant of Abraham is still alive, it must live in how we treat each other, not just how we speak of him. Then he did something no one expected. He stepped back from the mic, bowed his head and whispered, "Thank you for letting me speak." No applause, not yet, because everyone, including the rabbi, was still processing what they had just heard. The boy did not shout, he did not accuse, he simply revealed. And in doing so, the foundations of certainty beneath one man's robe began to tremble. Rabbi Eliam rose and adjusted his glasses slowly, though they hadn't slipped. It was a gesture measured deliberate, as if buying a few more seconds to gather himself. The boy's words, far from what he expected, had not only unsettled the crowd, but stirred something in him. He hadn't felt in years discomfort and reflection. The moderator broke the silence. "Rabbi Rosen, would you like to respond?" The rabbi nodded, rising from his seat with practiced calm. He stepped to the second podium, clearing his throat as his voice echoed across the great hall. "You speak beautifully, Yasin," he began, "and I commend your composure. But eloquence does not equal authority, and emotion is not theology." Some in the crowd murmured in agreement. Others remained quiet, wary of where this might lead. Rabbi Eliam continued, "Islam came centuries after the covenant. The Torah documents the direct line of Abraham's promise. It speaks not of a universal inheritance, but of a chosen lineage. You cannot rewrite what was divinely written." Yasin raised his hand gently. "May I respond?" The moderator nodded. Yasin stepped forward, his voice quieter now, but not weaker. "You are right, Rabbi. The Torah speaks of lineage, but it also speaks of submission. Ibrahim was not called a Jew, nor a Christian. He was called a submitter, one who surrendered to God." He glanced toward the crowd. "In Arabic, we call that Muslim." A few people leaned forward in their seats. Others exchanged glances. Even Rabbi Eliam narrowed his eyes slightly, not in anger but focus. "You say we came later," Yasin said, "but the truth doesn't belong to time. It belongs to the one who sent it. If Islam came last, it is not to erase what came before, but to restore what was lost." He looked at the rabbi again. "Do you believe God's message can be corrupted by men?" The rabbi didn't answer. Yasin continued gently. "Our prophet came not to replace Moses, but to confirm him. The Quran says, indeed, we gave Moses the scripture, and we caused it to be inherited by those who were guided." Quran 40:53. He turned slightly to the crowd. "How can we inherit what we deny? Islam does not erase Moses. It embraces him with love, with reverence, with prayer." Every single day the room was quiet again. But this silence was not shock, it was stillness. "Reverence, Rabbi." Eliam exhaled slowly. His tone changed, and yet he said, "Your people call us oppressors. Your Quran mentions us in anger. How can you speak of unity when your scripture separates us?" Yasin looked up, his eyes sincere. "Because the Quran speaks to moments, not races. When God criticizes, he criticizes actions, not blood. When he warns with justice, not hatred." He stepped forward closer to the podium. "Now you see rebuke, I see rescue. I see a scripture that still calls the people of the book back, not away. That's not condemnation, that's mercy." A man in the back wiped a tear from his eye. A woman reached for her scarf and pulled it over her head. The rabbi stood motionless. His world of lines and titles had just been crossed by a barefoot boy with no pulpit, no degree, and no anger, only light. And the most frightening part for him was that it felt true. For a moment, it wasn't a hall of scholars and spectators. It was just two souls, one old one, young, standing in the fragile space between history and healing. Rabbi Eliam's fingers trembled slightly on the edge of the podium. His gaze had shifted, not sharp like before, but heavy burden, and behind it, something deeper. Pain. He leaned forward and spoke, this time, not from intellect but from memory. I lost my grandfather in the camps. He was a rabbi too. When they burned his books, they burned his voice, but not his faith. The room grew stiller. My people, he continued, have spent centuries being displaced, demonized, slaughtered, and now when I hear the word Islam, I hear fear. I hear centuries of conflict, rejection, and yes, rage. He looked toward Yasin, voice strained. So forgive me if I struggle to see your book as a bridge. When I've only known it as a wall, it wasn't anger, it was confession. Yasin lowered his head, his voice now quieter than ever. And I lost my father in an airstrike. He was not a fighter, he was a teacher. He died holding my hand crushed under our home. Several people gasped softly. My mother Yasin said used to weep in silence. She'd pray beside the rubble and say, Allah is still watching Yasin. Even the dust hears his name. He paused, steadying his voice. I should have grown to hate, but I didn't. Not because I'm brave, but because the Quran wouldn't let me. He stepped forward. It said, do not let hatred of others make you swerve from justice. And I clung to that verse like it was the last thing unbroken in my life. The rabbi closed his eyes. His breathing grew uneven. He wasn't debating anymore. He was remembering his grandfather's letters, his mother's trembling hands, the smell of candle wax on Friday evenings. And now this child, born into rubble, quoting mercy. The paradox cracked his certainty. A soft voice rose from the front row. Is this still a debate? The moderator hesitated, then slowly shook his head. No, he whispered. This is something else. Yasin looked to the rabbi. I do not blame you for your grief. I only ask that you don't let it blind you to ours. Then, without waiting for applause or reaction, he added, if Abraham were here, he would not argue with either of us. He would say, stand together and call only to God. A murmur moved through the crowd like a ripple. Journalists lowered their pens. One cameraman turned off his device, not out of boredom but respect. The rabbi's eyes were glassed with tears. You're just a boy, he said hoarsely. How can you carry this much and still speak peace? Yasin's lips trembled. Because when you lose everything, you learn what can never be taken. The hall fell silent once again, not because the room was full of strangers, but because finally it was full of understanding. The hall was still, yet no longer stiff. What had begun as a formal interfaith debate had unraveled into something deeper. More human layers of armor were being shed, not just from the speakers but from the people watching. There were no more note-takers, no applause seekers. Only hearts exposed. Rabbi Eliam stepped back from the podium, his fingers curled tightly around its edge. His voice returned, but it had lost its polish. It was no longer framed in debate, etiquette. It was raw. You speak of mercy, he said, eyes locked on Yasin. You speak of unity, but unity is dangerous when it means forgetting who we are, forgetting our pain. Yasin nodded slowly. But what if unity doesn't erase pain? He replied gently. What if it redeems it? The rabbi blinked. That wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. Yasin stepped forward again, his small figure illuminated beneath the high chandeliers. I am not asking you to forget your suffering. Rabbi, I am asking you to let it soften you, not harden you. That's what Islam did to me. He paused, placing his hand on his chest. I used to cry for my father in the dark. I used to shake with anger. But then I read what the Prophet Muhammad did when he returned to Mecca, the city that had tortured him, killed his loved ones, exiled him. He turned to the crowd. He forgave them. He lowered his head and said, no blame will be upon you today. A gasp escaped from someone near the front. The rabbi's lips parted slightly. He had taught forgiveness for years, but he had never heard it delivered like that. Not from a boy, not from a Muslim, not from someone who had lost so much. Yasin stepped even closer to the rabbi now, close enough that he could see the tremble in the older man's chin. I am not here to be right, Yasin said. I am here to be truthful. The rabbi's hands slowly lowered from the podium. His gaze dropped. I don't know what to say, he murmured. I came prepared for an argument. I didn't come for this. Yasin smiled softly. Truth doesn't ask us to be ready. It asks us to be sincere. The words floated through the hall like incense, hanging long after they were spoken. One by one, audience members began to weep, not in grief but in release. A Christian woman near the back covered her mouth, tears dripping down her cheeks. A young Jewish man looked at his yarmulke, then to Yasin, as if seeing both differently now. And the Rabbi Eliam, Rosen scholar of scripture, defender of doctrine, reached for a handkerchief but missed. His hands were shaking too hard. He looked at Yasin, the boy who had come with no credentials, no title, no polished stage presence, and yet here he was, being led by him. Your words, the rabbi whispered, they cleanse. Yasin bowed his head, his voice barely above a breath. That is not me, Rabbi. That is the Quran. I only carry what healed me. The rabbi took a step forward. He reached out, not to argue, not to object, but to place his hand gently on Yasin's shoulder. I don't know what I believe anymore, he said. Yasin looked up at him with warm eyes. Then he said, you're finally ready to believe. And in that moment, ego surrendered, not to fear, not to force, but to a truth that spoke softly and carried light. The cathedral's tall windows, once silent witnesses to centuries of formality, now bathed the hall in a golden hue as the late afternoon sun streamed in. It cast a gentle light across the marble floor, where truth not power was now seated. Rabbi Eliam Rosen stood motionless beside Yasin, his hand still resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Around them, the crowd didn't move. No one shifted. Even the photographers had stopped taking pictures. Something sacred was happening, too delicate to disturb. The rabbi's voice trembled when he finally spoke. All my life, I've defended our truth with sharpness. I memorized texts. I debated scholars. I taught thousands. But today, he paused, then looked directly into Yasin's eyes. A child who lost everything reminded me of the one thing I forgot. He reached into the inside pocket of his robe and pulled out a small folded paper, yellowed and worn. My grandfather used to carry this, he said, slowly unfolding it. It's a verse he copied by hand before the Nazis came. The paper read in Hebrew, love mercy, act justly, and walk humbly with your God. Yasin read it silently, then looked up at the rabbi. That verse, he said, is in the spirit of Islam too. The rabbi's eyes filled. So why did it take me so long to see that? Yasin's reply was soft. Because truth is not always loud, Rabbi. Sometimes it whispers and we only hear it when our hearts are quiet. The old man stepped back. His breath quivered. He removed his glasses and pressed them into his palm as if releasing a weight. Then in full view of the crowd, Rabbi Eliam Rosen dropped to his knees. Not in conversion, not in defeat, but in surrender. To the truth he had run from, to the boy who had gently delivered it, to the God who had been patiently waiting. Gasps filled the room. One journalist began to cry. A priest in the second row bowed his head. A young Muslim man covered his face and whispered, Allahu Akbar. The rabbi whispered toward the floor. I do not know how to pray like you, but I want to learn. Yasin knelt beside him and placed a hand on his back. The first prayer, he said gently, is not with the tongue, it's with the heart. For a long while they remained there, elder and child, rabbi and refugee, joined not by debate or doctrine, but by divine presence. When Rabbi Eliam finally stood, he faced the audience. His eyes, once hard, were now open in a way they had never been. I came here to explain why Islam could not hold the truth, he said, but now I see. It carried what I lost: submission without fear, belief without pride, and mercy without condition. Yasin stood silently beside him. He wasn't smiling with victory. He was standing with humility, because he knew this wasn't about him. It was never about him. This was the victory of light over ego. And the moment Rabbi Rosen turned to Yasin and said, May I hear your Quran? The room erupted, not in applause but in tears, because they all knew. A line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. As the rabbi's trembling words still echoed across the ancient hall, a profound hush settled over the audience. The transformation that had taken root between Rabbi Eliam Rosen and young Yasin was palpable, unseen, yet deeply felt by every soul present. The once rigid lines of doctrinal debate had faded into a space where pain, hope, and humility intertwined. Rabbi Rosen, his eyes now glistening with tears, carefully replaced his glasses and took a deep breath. "I have spent my life defending a truth." He began, his voice soft and measured, a truth that I believed was carved in stone. "Today I see that truth is fluid, it is mercy, it is forgiveness, and it is found in the hearts of those who suffer." His words broke through the silence like a gentle exhalation, inviting everyone to listen with their hearts rather than their ears. Nearby, Yasin stood quietly, his gaze steady and compassionate. He had not sought applause nor accolades. His was a simple, resilient faith forged in loss and tempered by the mercy of the Quran. The two figures, so different in age and experience, now formed a bridge, a living testament to the possibility of unity beyond historical pain. In that moment, a young woman in the audience, a Jewish student, by the look of her gentle features and the delicate Star of David pinned to her blouse, began to weep openly. Her tears were not of sorrow for what had been lost, but of gratitude. Gratitude that someone had dared to listen to a refugee's truth. Others around her nodded slowly, some reaching out to console, others simply absorbing the rare beauty of vulnerability on a public stage. Rabbi Rosen extended his hand toward Yasin, and the boy placed his own hand in return. Their hands met in a gesture that transcended language and religion, a silent promise of connection, of reconciliation, of shared humanity. The moderator, usually the orchestrator of debates and discourse, stepped back, overwhelmed by the unfolding transformation. A hush deepened as Rabbi Rosen spoke once more, his voice now resonant with acceptance. "Tonight I have learned that our scriptures, our beliefs, are not weapons to be wielded against one another, but lanterns to guide us out of darkness." He paused, glancing into the eyes of those gathered. "May we all begin to see that in our common struggles, in our shared grief, and in our mutual hopes, there lies the capacity to rebuild not only our homes, but our hearts." From the back of the hall, soft murmurs of agreement spread like a gentle tide. Journalists and onlookers who had come expecting a clash of convictions now witnessed a quiet, revolutionary act of compassion. The camera lenses, once focused on conflict, captured instead the tender moment of handshaking and the reverence in every face. Outside, as the first stars emerged over the Parisian skyline, the crowd slowly dispersed in reflective silence. Some paused at the grand entrance of the hall, carrying with them the memory of the encounter, a reminder that even entrenched beliefs can be softened by human kindness. Rabbi Rosen and Yasin remained in the doorway for a long while, locked in silent conversation beyond words, united by an unspoken understanding that true dialogue heals old wounds. In that sacred pause, the boundaries of tradition gave way to the infinite possibilities of hope. And as the night embraced the city, one thing was certain. The legacy of that day was not recorded in debates or disputes. It was written in the quiet, enduring language of the heart. This story teaches us that true dialogue begins not with the desire to win, but with the willingness to listen. In a world divided by faith, politics, and history, the rabbi and the refugee reminds us that sincerity can break walls, that force cannot. Yasin, a young refugee who had every reason to carry bitterness, chose instead to speak with compassion and clarity. His restraint, rooted in the Quran, became more powerful than argument. And Rabbi Eliam, a man shaped by generational pain and theological pride, showed us that even the most rigid hearts can soften when truth is spoken gently. Their exchange reveals a deep truth for all of us, that being right is not as important as being real. When we approach others with humility, regardless of background, status, or age, we create space for hearts to transform. In life, we may encounter people who challenge our beliefs or misunderstand who we are. But if we respond with calm, truth, and mercy, we don't just defend our faith, we elevate it. This story invites us to ask, are we speaking to defeat or are we speaking to heal? Because in the end, it's not the loudest voice that wins, it's the most sincere.